Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's event on electoral reform in New York City. I'm Michael Hendricks, Director of State Local Policy here at MI. So New York City's first ranked choice primary is in the books, and we now know who the next mayor of New York City is. It looks to be Eric Adams, borough president of Brooklyn. We already know a few things as well. First of all, turnout seems to be substantially up, and yet a small share of the city's electorate seemingly has determined the city's next mayor. So with this primary in the books, we felt it was time to ask a bunch of questions. How did this election really go? How did ranked choice voting perform? And maybe what other electoral reform should New York City consider, and maybe other cities should learn from New York City's example. So to answer these questions and more, we have a terrific panel. Throughout our discussion, please enter your questions in whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll wrap them into the discussion as we go. First up, Josh Barrow. He's a columnist at Business Insider and host of KCRW's Left, Right, and Center. Next up, we have Reihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute. And last but certainly not least, David Schleicher, a professor of law at Yale Law School. Thank you all for joining us. Josh, let's start with you, and let's start really big picture. What happened yesterday?
Well, Eric Adams pulled it out. And, this obviously was the big suspense. He had a really substantial lead in the first preference votes. But what we had seen with all of the votes, excluding the absentee ballots, which were something like 20% of the votes cast, was that Kathryn Garcia, the former sanitation commissioner, was really doing a lot to make up ground by winning those second preference votes by a pretty wide margin. People who voted for neither Adams nor Garcia broke pretty overwhelmingly for Garcia. But what we saw is that it was just not enough. And I think that, we saw sort of two theories. Well, we saw three theories of how to win this election that produced different results. You had Maya Wiley trying to consolidate the left, which she did in a fairly traditional way by outcompeting the other lefty candidates for the first preference votes. Both Scott Stringer and Dianne Morales, for their own reasons, fell apart. And she sort of she swept up what vote was available there. You saw that people who did vote for Stringer in the end didn't necessarily break that strongly for Maya Wiley, because I think Stringer was left with some of his traditional political base, say on the Upper West Side, not necessarily people who were looking for the leftmost candidate in the race. And I think what we saw is that, in a citywide election, that's just not as large a part of an electorate as it looks like from the news coverage. It's not enough to win an election by itself. If you're going to win as Bill de Blasio, you need a real base of support among middle-class blacks in New York City, not necessarily on the political left to combine with the political left, which none of the lefty candidates managed to build in this campaign. You had Kathryn Garcia, who had basically the endorsement of the New York Times and the Daily News and Senator Liz Krueger, but not a lot of other institutional endorsements, basically being the candidate of technocrats in the media, which was very nearly enough to win with those second preference votes. And then you had Eric Adams building a very traditional New York campaign of a style that we've not really seen very much in recent decades, building a coalition of homeowners of a variety of races and ethnicities in the outer boroughs, public employee unions, various ethnic constituencies, including certain parts of the Orthodox Jewish community in New York, and basically building that coalition in a sort of machine-y way. And then also, you saw in the last week of the race some, I thought, pretty unfortunate messaging, basically suggesting that Kathryn Garcia and Andrew Yang were trying to box out a working class black or Hispanic candidate, although of course there was not a Hispanic candidate in the high running at the end. And it was sort of a more traditional divide and conquer approach, which got him to first place in the first preference votes. And the question was, was that off-putting to supporters of Maya Wiley, with whom he sparred very intensely toward the end of the campaign? Was that off-putting to people who are white New Yorkers or Asian New Yorkers, with the sort of suggestion that Andrew Yang was not really a person of color? And I think the answer was, it was a little bit off-putting, maybe, but not quite enough for him to lose, that he lost those ranked choice votes, but just barely enough. He got enough of those to win by 1 percentage point. So I think you saw the Garcia approach that really she was the candidate who I think most tried to make use of the ranked choice system, forming that quasi-alliance with Andrew Yang, really pursuing second choice votes from a number of voters. And it didn't work. But I think it creates a roadmap, because it almost worked, and shows how you can take advantage of ranked choice voting. And if you did just a little bit better, it would be a winning strategy. Whereas I think Adams shows how otherwise a more traditional style of campaign can still work in this sort of election.
Josh, all that makes sense. Did any of these results surprise you?
No. No, I mean, well, first of all, the result was very much in line with the polling. So whatever is wrong with polling right now, it doesn't seem to have been wrong in this race. I've seen some people saying that basically a key part of the problem in national polling is how there's a huge divide between Republicans and Democrats in trust levels, and it's hard to get low trust voters to answer polls. That may be less of an issue in a Democratic primary than it is in a general election. But so I think this, I think this result showed it was in line with the polls, and I think also, Adams is such a unique character that I think people lost a little bit how disciplined he was as a candidate. He was very on message, talking, crime was his number one message. And, if you asked him, what do we need to do to bring back the city economically? He says, you need to fight crime to bring back the city economically. And he had a message on crime that I think was very credible to a lot of voters that didn't really fit into a lot of the national fights that we have over police reform. He was not, he was not a defund the police candidate. And, as much as I've seen some sort of, drill style I'm not owned commentary from people on the left trying to say now, well, Adams was the police reform candidate, and it's not, the left was not defeated in this election because it didn't really try or whatever. Like it's a rejection of the lefty style on policing, but it is not an endorsement of the Donald Trump style on policing, and it is not a message about just we need to support the police and that's our way out from crime. Adams has a decades-long record on police reform and has a message that's about you need policing and it needs to be good and fair policing. And that has two parts. You need to fix the police when they are behaving badly, but you also need the police. And in some cases, you need more police. And I think this is a really common sense message that I think really did connect with a lot of voters in different parts of the city, different ethnicities. And so I think it was focused on concerns that people have right now in the city. And I think that I don't think it's surprising that was a winning message.
Rayhan, similar question to you. What did you see in this election, and did anything surprise you in these final results?
Just a few broad patterns. It is notable that turnout in the primary was higher than it was in 2013, the last time we had a really competitive race. So I understand it was 26% of the city's registered Democrats. You don't see the kind of turnout that you did in the late 80s and early 1990s, a moment that was just very polarized in New York City. Very polarized around racial and ethnic lines in particular, and when there was a real sense of urgency, but also when the city's electorate, its composition was considerably different. That was an era when you had many more native-born working class, lower middle class whites who were in the city. Many of those people have left. They've aged out of the electorate. So that was noteworthy. Also, when you're looking at this ranked choice election, it seems to have gone smoothly in the narrow sense that there weren't a ton of errors. Voters seemed to basically understand how the process worked. They were not overwhelmed by it. That was one conversation that was happening in the background, that basically there would be some kind of extreme, notable, pronounced racial bias in the outcome because different voters would not be able to engage with ranked choice. That doesn't appear to have been the case. Obviously, we'll know more in the weeks and months to come, but it does seem as though New Yorkers taking part in the primary were able to kind of master roughly how this was supposed to work. That's not to say that this process is going to become entrenched, that everyone will see it as a success, but that's one thing that didn't go wrong in an election where many things did go wrong on the administration front. And when it comes to the outcomes, part of it is just a question of salience. You had a lot of city council races on the ballot where people didn't necessarily know very much about their candidates. When you're voting within a given primary, you don't necessarily know how to differentiate them in terms of ideological sensibility. We also have, citywide offices like public advocate and comptroller that, I dare to say that a lot of decently well-informed voters don't understand especially well. You have borough presidents where, again, just beyond, maybe the fact that people have different surnames, I don't think that there are a lot of reasonably well-informed primary voters who could really differentiate these candidates in policy terms, particularly since a lot of these offices are bereft of meaningful authority. So I'd say that, in some respects, this went decently well. Ranked choice didn't turn out to be a major disaster. On the other hand, it really did raise some questions about how we structure elections in New York City. Some of the offices that we have in place, are they strictly necessary? So a lot for reform-minded people to think about.
And a lot of follow-up questions, but actually I want to turn to David really quickly. So Raihan mentioned the possibility of errors, and particularly administrative errors. Talk to us about the Board of Elections debacle, both the first time around issuing results maybe that were inaccurate, and then the brunch time debacle yesterday.
So the quick story is that when the Board of Elections first sought to run the ranked choice voting before absentee ballots came in, they included in the tallies a bunch of votes that were done as kind of a practice. And this is a screw up, and it did undermine confidence. And then today, or yesterday rather, the Board of Elections declared the results were coming out at brunch time, and only some people with an extremely expansive definition of brunch would have understood 5 o'clock as being part of brunch, kind of the all-day diner part of brunch. That said, I think in the end, this highlights what a ongoing comic disaster the Board of Elections is. It's one of the few non-professionalized, non-civil service parts of actually state government. It's run through this weird system of bipartisan boards that result in kind of a weird corruption, kind of patronage appointments to it. And it's if you look at national rankings of ease of vote, New York is dead last, almost no matter how you calculate. That said, we got pretty lucky because the election turned out, while it's close, it wasn't that close. And there's an idea in the election law literature of what's called the margin of litigation, which is how close does an election have to be that someone could credibly sue to overturn the result by challenging ballots and forcing a recount and that sort of thing. And this looks like it's outside. It's a full percentage point. I mean, what the margin of litigation is varies by election and by state. But it looks like this will be was sufficient in the end to mean that all of the kind of ongoing process disasters aren't going to fundamentally change the election. Also, the fact that the candidate who seemed most likely to challenge and who had been opposed to RCV from the beginning won, which also removes some of the possibility of kind of a Bush versus Gore style disaster going forward. But one thing it did highlight is that even though turnout was up this time, New York's election laws are, again, the worst in the country. I don't think it's hard to find anyone who would disagree with that. That if you look at the variety of debates and fights we're having about states cutting back voting access around the country, they're cutting it back to situations that are substantially more liberal in voting access than New York City has. Now, this is our first run at early voting, for instance. And the combination of the low information, off-cycle nature of the election and the voting access problems do result in even if it's higher than 2013, something that is like not, to call it democracy, but it's certainly not mass representative.
All right, there's some great questions coming in from the audience. Please keep them coming in. We'll get to them in a moment. Josh, quickly to you, something that Raihan mentioned is just how many races that you may end up voting on. We don't really know maybe who all the players are, how to differentiate between them. How much did endorsements matter, in your opinion, in this cycle? So we had AOC's endorsement, New York Times endorsing Kathryn Garcia. We also had some interesting splits within the unions. How much did they matter? What did they tell you?
Oh, I think they mattered a great deal. I mean, I think that, I think the newspaper endorsements very nearly propelled Kathryn Garcia to victory, for one thing, in the mayor's race, the highest salience race in this election. I think if you're Brad Lander, I think you owe a debt to AOC. And obviously AOC was not the only. Lander also had the New York Times behind him, for example. But I mean, I think everyone thought Corey Johnson was going to walk away with that as the best known candidate in that race. And I think that even though people don't pay a ton of attention to the comptroller race, I think you saw sort of if you're a competency, good government type voter, you see the New York Times. If you're a lefty voter, you see the lefty groups lining up behind Lander, and that was enough to make the difference there. That also was not a huge win margin. It was a little bit wider than the mayor's race margin. And then I think the council races, I think you get cues both from the endorsements and from the style of the messaging about is this the more lefty candidate in this race, and I think you see voters do follow those heuristics in those races. So I think that I would like to see these elections conducted in even number years simultaneously with federal elections, so we get a higher turnout, and so people only have to pay attention at one time. But I think I think those clues actually there seems to be a coherence in terms of what voters chose in this race. That I think, with the endorsements being a key driver that got them there.
All right, so we're going to be getting into ranked choice voting and other electoral reforms in greater depth in just a moment. But Raihan, really quickly, so question from the audience, and I think this is something that you've been talking about too. Tim asks, what did ranked choice voting do in the non-mayoral races? Did it make a difference in council member races? And I think this kind of opens up a broader question, Raihan. Just what did you see in the less shiny, flashy races that everybody was paying attention to? What did you see?
Well, I'm very curious to hear what David and Josh have to say about that. The truth is that, when it comes to the council races, I don't really discern any obvious pattern. My sense is that there is this emerging conventional wisdom as ranked choice voting has spread, in municipal elections in a number of different cities, that it does not seem to have made that dramatic a difference. RCV proponents have made many claims on its behalf. Many of them seem pretty attractive. For example, the idea that campaigns will be less negative, that you will basically see consensus candidates emerge, people will be more broadly positive, people who are more aligned with the median voter, and also that this might actually have some change in policy outcomes. This revival of ranked choice voting is still relatively young. So I don't know if we can say much that's definitive right now. I will say that in New York City, I did notice people learning over time. For example, you did see people, begin by being very reluctant to campaign together. And towards the end of it, it seems that the willingness of Kathryn Garcia to campaign with Andrew Yang, she apparently also reached out to Ray McGuire and some other candidates as well, that seemed to have made some material difference. You also saw many of the larger advocacy groups, many of the larger labor unions and what have you, choosing to rank slates of candidates, say that this is our first choice or second choice or third choice. So there did seem to be some learning going on. And over time, perhaps that will make a difference as well. But there's a paper that was just published earlier today, a working paper, I should say, by PhD student Arjun Vishwanath at Harvard, just arguing that, really ranked choice voting has been a bit of a nothing burger in terms of shaping policy outcomes. I am still a kind of optimist about ranked choice voting. I still think that it can do some good. And I do think that we saw some hints of that, but I don't think you can make any kind of definitive argument. When it comes to the council races, you were asking about the AOC endorsement, for example, and AOC, her Courage to Change PAC played a very interesting role in which it wasn't an endorsement per se, but she released a questionnaire. And here I thought, you saw something telling. She released a questionnaire, and if you got a perfect score on her questionnaire, then you would be listed as someone who has, who was kind of kosher, who kind of got this kind of Courage to Change seal of approval. And it was amazing to see that in many council races throughout the city, including in the 39th district where I live, you had multiple candidates who got a perfect score on it. So, you'd think that, hey, these are tools that allow us to differentiate. This is someone who is, let's say, an AOC style progressive as opposed to a Kathryn Garcia style progressive, something like that. But even there, you just literally had candidates marching in lockstep, including on some, pretty idiosyncratic issues where you'd think that there would be genuine disagreement among Democratic voters in these districts. So, that was a bit discouraging. And I think that that's certainly something that you saw in city council races, just the fact that there wasn't a lot of ideological differentiation. If you look at the Manhattan Borough president candidates, for example, I would have thought maybe there's going to be a more growth-friendly candidate who's going to emerge, someone who is, very much, a social progressive, someone who's a loyal partisan Democrat, but who thinks that we ought to, moderately relax land use regulation. But you didn't see any of that. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. Perhaps it's because these races are so low salience and that what really matters is the endorsement of local Democratic clubs. But that's one thing that I noticed that I found discouraging.
Josh, let's dive into RCV just a little bit more. So, was it a nothing burger, like Raihan said, or not?
I think we can point to cases where it mattered. I mean, Bill Perkins, who's a councilman from Upper Manhattan, who frankly is losing a step, who was widely expected not to seek re-election, and sort of at the last minute, it surprises everyone by filing. It's this very crowded field, and in a traditional race, he might have run up the middle of that field. In fact, I believe he was first on the first preference votes. But you did see that he ended up behind in the end, as some of the opposing candidates, their votes shifted toward each other, and he ended up losing. So you can point to examples where it mattered in the way that it is supposed to matter by preventing the division of a field. But I think it's true that what we saw here is what's been seen in most other places, which is that usually you get the same result from a ranked choice election that you would have gotten under a standard format of election. So I don't think it's a huge deal. I also think it's a little bit incongruous that we have ranked choice voting only in a Democratic primary, and then we have a traditional partisan general election, which essentially means that half of the city's electorate is excluded from participating at all in the selection of the mayor. I don't think that's a really desirable system, and I think that the logical endpoint is to do what you see in San Francisco, for example, where if you're going to have a ranked choice election, it should be a nonpartisan election, and the ranked choice is the system that does the bit of winnowing the ideological coalitions. So I don't think we have a perfect system here, but I think it has been an incremental improvement compared to what we had previously.
David, what's your sense? Is it at least an incremental improvement? Does it also just demonstrate a win for local political reform, or is this kind of a rabbit trail?
So one thing I'd say is that I think RCV worked better than it worked in other places, in that you understand the goals of RCV to be two things. One is to give a relative advantage to acceptable politicians, and then secondly, to punish negative campaigning. The fact that Garcia did so much better in the ranked choice voting are kind of speak to both of those things, that she was broadly acceptable, and that Adams kind of took on some water for being so negative late in the race. But I think more broadly that reform types, of which I'm one also, can overrate electoral reform relative to what's going on structurally in politics. And one of the things that we didn't see and haven't seen in New York for a while, but could see and have seen in other places, is the development of kind of strong inside party coalitions that endorse candidates up and down the ballot, that run on a kind of common platform. You didn't see Eric Adams-like candidates in city council races, or Kathryn Garcia-like candidates. You saw kind of random people no one knew very much about, or that barely exist. And same thing in the borough president's race, or even take the most prominent second non-mayoral race. It would be hard to locate who Brad Langer or Corey Johnson was like among the mayoral candidates. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. And the absent that kind of coalitional formation, it's very hard for voters to get accurate cues about what the other candidates are all about. Further, on some basic kind of political science, democratic theory, that you're going to expect what a city council person is going to do is necessarily a collective rather than individual enterprise. No individual council person can enact policy. Controller can do some stuff. Public advocate, that job doesn't really even exist. And so it's a press release job. It's so weird. But the absence of coalitions, of strong coalitions, of kind of internal party organizations, makes politics less organized and harder to follow for voters. It super empowers endorsing groups to some degree, because in the absence of a Adams-like coalition, a kind of up and down ballot, or a Garcia or Wiley or whatever, things like the New York Times or 32BJ or any of the unions or whatever can have an outsized voice, giving the only content that voters can seize on. But the reform exists inside a world in which politics is going on, and that is as much as anything else structuring outcomes and explaining what happens in things like ranked choice voting.
So there's a question from the audience asking that, maybe now that progressives from Henry, now that progressives will conclude that ranked choice did not work for them, and also you see the potential upcoming election of somebody who was an RCV opponent, will RCV be repealed in NYC?
So I don't know whether it'll be repealed in NYC. I think that the thing that RCV wasn't the problem for progressives. It's not like they, in the mayoral race, that they would have done better under any other circumstance. I mean, the candidate finished second or the third, the most preferred by left-wing candidate. I mean, the big problem they had is that lots of people voted. I mean, so even though turnout in the mayoral race is low relative to, say, the mayoral race in Chicago or San Francisco, it's still a lot more people than showed up in a, state assembly primary or even a congressional primary, and as a result, the kind of greater organization that some of those groups have kind of ran into the fact that there were just more people who don't share that politics, and so I don't think that progressives will determine which I assume they mean the kind of left wing of the party, the AOC groups are going to have any particular. This is going to take this as good or bad for RCV. I do think Adams didn't like it, and Adams, as kind of a kind of a classic party politician, might have said, has already expressed a great deal of skepticism of it. It certainly works against his interests. So if there's opposition, it's going to come from there, not from the left of the party.
Yeah, it's certainly helped, though, that he still won. He still won under that system. So, David, just sticking with you for a moment, you talked about other jurisdictions that use RCV. Josh mentioned how potentially you could have RCV paired with other reforms, like dropping party ID. What, in your sense, David, can we learn from other jurisdictions and how they use ranked choice voting that maybe New York City can or should be learning from? So
most urban elections in America are nonpartisan. And in theory, so it's an overwhelming majority of urban elections are local government elections are nonpartisan, municipal ones. And in theory, this is reducing information available to voters. Right, so the party heuristic is federal election is like extremely useful. That you had to determine who of 6 candidates were running for Congress, you didn't know what party they were from. It would be hard to know who to vote for in a way that the party is actually a very good and useful bit of information. Maybe the only useful bit of information, actually finding out things about individual candidates running for Congress would probably be would confuse you more than it would help you in terms of casting an accurate vote. But in urban elections, the New York City partisan thinking has 2 effects. One is, as Josh noted, it limits the electorate. If we're going to have primary elections, that limits the number of people who can vote because there are only many people are independents or Republicans, and that in an election like Chicago's or San Francisco's, you have a much broader electorate, including lots of people are independent, in addition to being the few people in San Francisco are Republicans. But the second thing it does is that in the general election, one of the kind of stark findings of political science about subnational elections is that we might as well not hold the general election. Everything about the general election is determined by presidential preference. That the correlation between the best studies on state legislative elections, but it'd be equally true for city council. I can give a great example of in a second. Track presidential voting now at like the 95 to 99% range. It's the same thing. So if you know whether someone's going to vote for Biden or for Trump or whatever, you will know how they vote in city council races, no matter what. My favorite example of this is that when Bloomberg was running for re-election, his district, the district with Gracie Mansion in it, had this candidate who was he actually, I think he's written for y'all, but was like the resume god of all resume gods. He was a law school graduate and an MD. He was a professor at Columbia Medical School, a doctor. He was endorsed by all the papers. And while Bloomberg, his platform was, I'm going to do whatever Michael Bloomberg does. I am a Bloomberg candidate running on the Upper East Side. I should be a shoo-in. He got the same percentage of the vote as George Bush got in that district. Doesn't matter. General elections follow presidential voting extremely closely. And given that, and given the restricted nature, the case for nonpartisan or kind of alternative methods of election goes up. Whereas ordinarily, like if someone was in favor of nonpartisan elections for Congress, you should think that they're a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. This is here the case is much, much stronger.
Ryan, what is your take on other reforms paired with RCV? You talked about on-cycle versus off-cycle elections. There's multi-member districts, jungle primaries. Like what other reforms do you see in other places that maybe New York City could learn from?
So Daniel Hopkins published an MI issue brief recently on how to address declining turnout in big city elections. And one of his chief recommendations, one that David mentioned as well, is the idea, and that Josh mentioned too, is the idea of moving these elections on cycle. And I think that one argument that's oftentimes made against this proposal is that this would further exacerbate the nationalization of our politics. But as David mentioned a moment ago, actually there's some reason to believe that that's not the case, because when you're thinking about your partisan identity, thinking about the expressive value of voting, it's possible that you can satisfy that by voting one way in a federal election. But then, when it comes to high visibility, say state or local elections, you might be willing to think a bit differently there. So it could be that this will not only increase turnout, but actually improve competitiveness at the state and local level, which I think would be a very good thing. And there are a variety of other approaches as well. For example, Connor Harris at MI wrote a piece for City Journal endorsing proportional representation. This is an idea that is entirely compatible with ranked choice voting. There are many jurisdictions that use a single transferable vote. There are many market democracies that use a broadly similar system too. And the idea there is to reflect the true political diversity by allowing people who are not necessarily part of one of the two major political parties to have a fair shot at winning seats, even if they don't necessarily command a plurality of the vote in any given district. There are many different ways to structure that. You could do that with larger multi-member districts. You could do that with a multi-member district that consists of the entire city as a whole. But you could also do it on the basis of boroughs. Just combine, let's say, 4 or 5 existing city council districts. But I think that this would be a very, very good thing, partly because if you think about conservatives, political conservatives in New York City, certainly very, very far from being a majority or a plurality in the city. But actually, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of voters, right? And also, when you're talking about people who represent political minorities in New York City, if you're seeing those people represented across the city as a whole, you're actually seeing a kind of truer reflection of what the kind of urban center right looks like than if you're just looking at the 4 or 5 districts where it's possible for a Republican to get over the threshold. You might start seeing people who come from denser, more transit-oriented parts of the city who also happen to be center right on a range of other issues, in ways that I think could complicate our politics in a useful way, could lead to new coalitions emerging. And also, by the way, it reflects the fact that in a city like New York, partly because of the nationalization of our politics, these local center-left coalitions are very unwieldy and encompass people who have very, very different views on core policy questions relevant to New York City. We've all been talking about the fact that, there are differences of opinion on policing, differences of opinion when it comes to land use, a whole range of other quality of life issues that really, really matter, that don't necessarily map onto our national politics. So my emphasis would be on finding ways that we can kind of surface the real political diversity that you have in a city like New York. No guarantee that it's necessarily going to lead to kind of dramatically different outcomes when it comes to fiscal politics, for all the reasons that David had mentioned before. There are structural considerations, there are interest group politics, lots of other things that kind of help shape those policy outcomes. But I do think that it's something that's worth experimenting with. That's one thing that I find, very sad about how democracy is practiced. We have federalism. We have municipal governments that have wide authority to pursue election administration in different ways. let's use it. Let's try to be creative and thoughtful.
Josh.
One thing I would note, and I don't know exactly what the reason for this has been, is that New York historically has had a tradition of overcoming the thing where general elections are irrelevant in a highly lopsided political jurisdiction. Obviously, you had 5 consecutive wins by candidates on the Republican line in mayor's races from 2001 from 1993 through 2009, and then in other ways as well, with fusion voting and John Lindsay and the parties sort of recombining in ways to create new coalitions. I'm wondering what the reason is that that's happened in New York. Maybe that's a reason that we've kept the partisan elections because they weren't as absurd as it seems like they ought to be, and whether there's a way for there to be a meaningful general election in this city again.
So the research is just, it's about the salience of the mayor's race. The mayor's a super famous figure, and for the same reason you see out-party governors in Massachusetts or Vermont, or that it's sufficiently high profile that people are able to develop their own party brands. The famous line about this comes from George Washington Plunkett, referring to reform being, he was referring to the Seth Low administration, but the same idea which is reform is a morning glory. It rises in the morning and looks beautiful, but the party is an old oak. It kind of lasts over time. And you see that it's also true down ballot, which is that even as Bloomberg or Giuliani or Lindsay, it wasn't like you were seeing a huge number of reform city council members. Back 100 years ago, that you did see, more than 100 years ago, you did see that some more of that of a local reform kind of party organization. One other thing I'll say is that the success of top of the ballot Republicans or reform or kind of independents and the failure down ballot is actually partially, I think, a product of the decline of the political machine. So that the down ballot stuff that it used to be that if you go back to reform efforts in the Seth Low, that 120 years ago type stuff, that people would run a full slate against the machine. And you would have a reform coalition that was attempting to take over city government. Now you just have a single guy, Bloomberg, spending $1 trillion running for mayor, and that can be more effective because the parties are less organized. But at the same time, there's no like corpus to run against across city council races and across. And so I think those two things are related. But the mayoralty is like, it's one of the most famous becomes one of the most famous politicians in America, and is very well covered. And so you can see general elections that matter for that, or you could imagine that happening. It won't be this year because, but you could imagine that in other contexts. Whereas it's like very, very, very hard to imagine someone becoming famous enough to overcome their party ID to win a race for Brooklyn Borough president.
Is this, David? Is this where on ballot cues would make a difference? So just listing endorsements or information about that politician who's not the famous mayor.
So this is mostly the kind of things that I propose kind of in a theoretical sort of way, but it's I think it's at least potentially attractive. The idea is that in the absence of parties organizing preferences, so you don't have competitive parties bisecting elections, giving voters lots of information, you might want to give them information other ways. So to what the evidence that voters are able to understand the things that political elites think they should understand, but who they should vote for based on their ideology and their actual behavior, the research suggests is somewhat mixed. Like we think that a left endorsed politician should get voters who think of themselves as left, and we think whatever. And the evidence that that's true in low salience elections is pretty weak. Voters mostly just have no idea what's going on and kind of use other cues. So either if they can determine the race or ethnicity of or gender of the politician from the politician's name, or does the person have some kind of famous name, that kind of stuff turns out to be extraordinarily powerful. In fact, there's amazing research that shows that in nonpartisan elections down ballot, you can get people to say, I'm going to vote for Jim. And then you tell them facts about Jim, and while they're on the phone, they'll switch their preferences. So just they'll be like, but do you know that Jim is actually a Democrat? And they'll go, oh, or Jim is actually a Republican. They'll be like, oh, actually, I take the exact opposite position. Like having forthrightly said that they were for it. And so the providing information on ballot seems to me very powerful thing. There's a huge amount of evidence that actual information on the ballot is extraordinarily important. So this is like people's names, so that if you have a last name that ends in O, you do better in Italian neighborhoods, regardless of whether or not you're Italian. And in South Carolina, which had a long tradition of not female politicians not doing well, that's changed over time. But that one of the most successful judicial candidates was a woman named James. So you see this kind of thing happen. You happen all the time.
Huh.
Mm. So there's another context too, where you have people not. So of course you have people not really understanding what's happening down ballot races, but there's also the increasing nationalization of politics, right? I mean, this is something that you've written a lot on, David. So I wonder, is the continued kind of nationalization of state and local politics, is it going to continue? Is that inevitable? What have we gained or lost in these years of nationalization?
Well, so I mean, there's a normative question and a positive question. The
Right.
positive question I'd say is like the two sources people suggest have driven the nationalization are something about the media. So decline of local newspapers, that kind of thing as explained. And the other one is the decline of local parties as organizations to structure local politics. And both of those things appear to be continuing unabated. In many ways, I think Eric Adams might stand for a proposition that like he's got a politics that, as Josh noted, don't fit neatly into kind of our at least internal Democratic Party conflicts, and stands for a type of organization that may lead to some localization. And on the media side, like, I don't know, if you want to look for green shoots, you could look at things like the rise of like the city and other kind of nonpartisan foundation-supported media, or
The continued salience of City Journal, yes.
The terrific journal. I mean, City Journal has really done an amazing job of kind of laying out kind of some of the best policy journalism about the election. But also, I mean, Substacks. I mean, you could tell a story. There's not a lot of evidence of that these things are having mass effects. You've seen left, you've seen right. So there's some exciting things going on. But those two things, media and party organization, are the two driving forces. And, like for nationalization of elections, and it seems like those things are going to continue. Other people, I'm curious what you guys.
Yeah, I wonder about your take, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with New York is that New York never really had the decline of the local media in the way that other markets had. So I think, say what you will about New York City, we've had a very robust press corps covering these sorts of races all the way through, I think. So I don't, I don't think that's I don't think that's been a big factor.
Readership has fallen now. And the Metro coverage of the New York Times has fallen. I mean, like the New York Times and the pay more attention to national elections, even though the papers themselves haven't died.
Right. New York Daily News is getting cut. The Wall Street Journal's local New York City desk is being cut. I mean, there is a lot of coverage being cut, but you could also just say that New York City started such a high watermark of local journalism that you could still lose a lot, and there's still a lot more coverage than you see in other jurisdictions, right?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the coverage of this race was actually largely pretty good, with the exception of the sort of psychodrama around Andrew Yang. That, in retrospect looks pretty unimportant.
But wait, this is fascinating that it took us this long to talk about Andrew Yang.
Yeah.
I mean, this was somebody who dominated the race for large stretches, right?
Yes. I mean, although I think, part of the question of what's dominating the conversation, I mean, I think, I stare at Twitter all day, and so probably do you. And so like what we perceive as dominating the conversation about the mayor's race is not necessarily what's on CBS2 and what a typical voter is actually consuming about the race. So there was, there seemed to be a lot of attention paid to the fact that Andrew Yang had a lead in the polls and left-wing activists hated him. And, you can tell a story about, left-wing activists took their eye off the ball and didn't pay attention to Eric Adams, who was really probably worse for their interests. And, Ross Barkan was trying to tell anyone who would listen that Eric Adams was the candidate that the left really needed to worry about. But it's not clear to me that any of that really mattered. And, when people tuned into the race, I think that, the Adams who always looked like a plausible winner the whole way through this and was doing well in the polls the whole way through, had the more coherent message and the deeper political base, and the clearer. It wasn't clear what Andrew Yang's story was about why he should be mayor. And I think when people really tuned in, you had you had Adams with a clear story about what he would do, and you didn't really have that with Yang. So I think that the outcome makes sense. Although I'll be honest, I thought it was quite plausible that Yang was going to win this thing if you asked me a few months ago. So I'm not saying I predicted his falling apart, but I think that people talked about Joe Biden and name ID, and that was wrong, and it was actually Joe Biden was had the deepest base and the best resume and all of these things, whereas I think with Andrew Yang maybe we were seeing a real pure name ID effect there.
David, I see you.
Yeah. So one thing I want to quickly add is that another important feature of nationalization is the lack of local ideological organizations, think tanks and stuff. And so one thing that is so exciting about what you guys are doing is that it's like one of the only, not the only, but one of the only locally focused or urban policy focused think tanks. And the absence of that also is one of the things that the absence of other ones like this, you see in national level, millions of these organizations, one of the things that makes elections lose some of their local color.
So speaking of work published by think tanks, local think tanks in City Journal, Raihan, there was a piece by Steve Tellis on kind of, the factionalization of politics and, to what degree could we see like an urban GOP faction rise up. So I wonder what your take is on how emerging party factions on the right and left that we see at the national level beginning to appear, what that might mean for local political competition. Are we going to see more local factions arising? Is it even possible today? What would that mean?
It's hard for me to say whether or not these factions are going to emerge as kind of disciplined intra-party organizations with a clear identity, with a clear brand. I do think that it would be enormously valuable if that were to happen. Right now, if you're looking at the Republican coalition, one thing you've seen over time is that you see this intense density divide, this urban-rural polarization, which is kind of one kind of larger macro trend, and that's one thing that I think has contributed to the fact that within major cities you just don't have competitive partisan elections at the general election level. But I also think that there's another interesting counter trend in which, if you look at the difference between 2016 and 2020, some of the areas where Donald Trump made significant gains were in urban cores. Now, those gains weren't enough to, make those competitive elections within those urban cores, but they were meaningful. And also, if you're looking at some affluent, college-educated suburban areas, those areas became more monolithically Democratic and somewhat less Republican than they did relative to 2016. So one can imagine a scenario in which a kind of center-right political party is building a coalition which says, we're going to write off not the urban cores, but rather we're going to write off some of those, kind of affluent, highly educated suburbs and, not expect to win the urban cores, but expect to improve our margins there somewhat. That seems like a very exotic scenario relative to where we are right now. But, when you look at some of the ethnic depolarization happening in our politics and the intensifying educational polarization, it's not an entirely ridiculous outcome. One thing that could grease the wheels of translating what you see happening at the national level into the local level is the emergence of local party factions, that again have a kind of consistent branding that can kind of recapture some of that energy you're seeing in non-college educated communities that, dissent from certainly the kind of, hard left progressive line that you've seen emerge in a number of cities. We've done quite a bit of polling work under your direction, Michael, at MI, where we're surfacing that, again, there's a fair bit of diversity when it comes to issues like school choice, when it comes to issues like proactive policing, even with respect to land use. You see very different views among rank and file voters than you do among, very ideologically engaged activists in municipal politics. Now, again, these surveys are imperfect, right? What does it look like once you bring partisan cues into the mix? You could see very different outcomes. What does it look like when you have a determined opposition? What are the things that are actually affecting policymakers beyond public opinion, which can, change pretty easily, which is not necessarily rock solid? These are all legitimate questions, but I do think that they're I think that the idea of having factions with meaningful brands that exist below the level of the national parties would be a good and healthy development.
David, Josh, go for it.
I was just going to say, if that hasn't emerged now, I don't know what the circumstances are that would bring it about in New York. I mean, you had the De Blasio mayoralty, and his numbers were pretty lackluster through it, and he was sort of an avatar of the leftward shift of the Democratic Party. And not only did you see a weakening of the Republican Party in the city, and no real apparent effort to peel off part of the Democratic base into a new coalition for that. Then you have this Adams victory, and Eric Adams, I think, has been very attentive to the sorts of concerns, especially rhetorically, of people who might be concerned that Democratic parties in cities have gone a little nuts and gone really far to the left. And I think the messaging that he's put out on a number of issues, including education and housing and crime, I think has been attentive to really trying to get closer to the median voter in New York City. And so I don't know what that coalition would look like. I think that Adams is a particularly poor mayor against whom to try to peel off an ethnically diverse, more politically moderate part of the Democratic Party. I think that's where you find his base. And I don't think we can see a way toward a sort of fusionist good government coalition against, if Adams is a reincarnation of the Democratic machine, I don't think you're going to see lefty activists who have their own set of objections to Eric Adams pairing up with conservatives in the city who would have objections to that machine. So I think that, certainly it's appealing, the idea that any political jurisdiction should have two equally balanced political forces, and the coalition should organize themselves to create that. But I think Eric Adams has put the city's Democratic Party in a very strong position to continue the irrelevance of Republicans and other opposition to Democrats in New York City.
Well,
David, you've
put this
written
a bit
on this.
differently. Sorry, Michael. Just briefly on that point. One interesting question is whether Eric Adams, if he does indeed, if he wins the election in November, as I expect he will, and if he proves to be moderately successful, does he develop some kind of distinctive brand within the Democratic Party? Is there some, latter-day equivalent of the New Democrats that emerges, but that is more explicitly oriented towards, let's say, voters of Latin American origin, African American voters who are older, middle-aged, working class, middle class, people who want to get on the property ladder or already are. When you look at someone like a Richie Torres by national standards is very much a progressive. He's someone who's championed various safety net expansions. When it comes to local issues, he's pretty explicitly pro-growth, cares a lot about quality of life issues. In a lot of ways, is pretty aligned with someone like an Eric Adams. Do you see some kind of party brand that's not the Democratic Party emerge to be competitive within primary elections? And is that something that starts to crack things open? And, similarly, do you see things with Republican parties that are competing in other areas? I think you're right that it's, I don't see a Republican mayor, in New York City's medium-term future. But I think that this idea of party factions that become more disciplined and organized could actually be pretty meaningful for a lot of Democrats, including machine Democrats who feel, a bit outflanked, where they want to provide useful information that can help them kind of cultivate new allies, kind of bring people into city council races, et cetera. So I think that kind of factional idea isn't necessarily about, strengthening Republicans in New York City.
So I think that's the most hopeful story you can tell about Eric Adams' mayoralty, is that he provides a structure to New York City politics, that he both provides a strong coalitional form and something to organize against, to create an internal party fight that approximates democracy. And this is, I think, that the question of what form that opposition takes is interesting. Does it take a reformist, Garcia-ish New York Times elite sort of thing, or does it take a more leftward type of opposition to him? Is he able to co-opt one side of that or the other? But I think that that's the most hopeful story you can tell about New York democracy right now, is that you can, if you squint real hard, you can see the emergence of what look like strong factions. Now, it's possible that none of that happens, and that he's just kind of a a corrupt glad handler who manages to buy off all sorts of things and keep politics in a disorganized way, does not press a kind of clear ideological line across policy areas, that he doesn't push any ideological line across policy areas, except for maybe policing. Who knows? But if you want to be optimistic, and I'm an optimistic person, I would say I think that that's the story you tell, is that that Adams, by basically recreating the old machine, has given, not only provided a politic and a voice for that type of voter, but also created a voice for an opposition to emerge. Whereas someone like de Blasio, who strategically and intentionally confused those divisions, right, who had bits of each of it, made the emergence of this kind of factional politics impossible or difficult or challenging. And so I think that's the most hopeful thing to say about the mayoral race, which is that, like, I think with the most exciting version would be an Eric Adams who pursued ideological lines of the sort that Rehan just described, and then an emergence either of a leading Garcia-like figure or a leading, I don't know, like lefting-like figure to challenge and give us like a real citywide politics that kind of went up and down the ballot. I think would be a very salutary development for New York City.
Josh, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. I just, I think that the sort of similarly to how de Blasio like created a lot of personal animus, especially among people in the media and that sort of thing, but failed to develop a real, clear, where the locus of opposition was to him. I guess partly because I'm relatively optimistic about and Adams' mayoralty, and because I'm optimistic about the national economic environment, I think he's unlikely to be such a disaster, for example, that he really gives a lot of fuel to that sort of good government movement in opposition to him. Maybe I'm mistaken, but like I think I think that the city has basically, I mean, obviously the pandemic has been this huge challenge unto itself, but prior to the pandemic, the city was just, I sort of felt like chugging along in a way that suppressed the level of political urgency about disputes in a way that I think, I wasn't here in the 1980s, but it seems like the presence of an acute crisis made it easier to have those sorts of divisions. And if things continue to be, sort of the acceptably static in the city, I think that makes it harder for that sort of that sort of crystallized opposition to emerge. I don't think it's just about the mayor's political behavior itself.
So if you were to offer one kind of key electoral recommendation to either an Eric Adams or really to the state, what would it be? What would you say, look, we've learned these lessons from RCV, going into the next cycle, here's what we can do better. Whether or not an Eric Adams or a Cuomo or anybody will actually accept it, Josh, what would be your recommendation? Biggest improvement?
I think we need to blow up the Board of Elections structure. I think we need a professionalized, normal election administration system, and that has to be done by the state. And it's one of these, often these agencies that are a disaster in New York, it's because it's not completely unclear who's in charge, and you have, there's a state aspect and a city aspect, and here you need state legislators to agree to change the way that works. And I would have a nonpartisan on-year election to go with the ranked choice approach. I think you should have it simultaneous with the presidential election. Get as many people as possible turning out to vote in this election. So those are the things that I would do if I were fixing the system.
Rehan, do you agree? What else would you add?
I do agree, and this is pie in the sky, but I do think that beyond, in addition to Josh's recommendations, I should say, I think that I would love to see a big, diverse American city embrace proportional representation. One big concern for a lot of people is just representation, descriptive representation, just making sure that people who belong to minority groups are adequately represented in the political system. I think that ideological minorities count there, but when you're looking at a lot of minority groups, they are not necessarily hyper concentrated in segregated neighborhoods. That's been the paradigm when you're looking at, voting rights legislation for a very long time, but it's not always necessarily true. And I think that proportional representation, multi-member districts are one way that you can surface that kind of diversity. Again, that's going to be a bridge too far for some people, but I'd love to have that as part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. David?
So I endorse a lot of the electoral reform ideas. Also, the one thing I would encourage Eric Adams to do, and maybe also Andrew Cuomo, is to get directly involved in lower level elections himself and try to build out a coalition. So that doesn't require electoral reform, but it is something that is within his control, which makes it useful as advice, I hope, which is that it would be attractive if he attempted to build a little party. Internal to the Democratic Party that would give structure to our politics and allow people to vote for something or against something. It would also help him pass things, which I think would be something that he might find attractive. So I would encourage him to start getting involved in every weird off-cycle, city council race and attempting to build out the machinery of an internal Democratic Party faction.
David, Raihan, Josh, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Please subscribe to the fine institutions represented here, including Manhattan Institute. Stay tuned for more virtual events just like this. And if you're in New York City, go vote in November. And for everybody else, remember, these local elections and these local politics do matter. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.